everyone. My name is Lynne Bowman from Uppsala University's Transformative Play Initiative. And today we're going to talk about finding the self in role-playing games, weaving myth, narrative, and identity together. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, also called the monomyth. So for Campbell, myth and the hero's journey specifically has these deep symbolic structures for meaning making. And these focus around the development of personal and social identity. So many people find identifying with the hero empowering. They use his challenges and his achievements as a way to make personal meaning in their lives. And this mirrors the process of maturation and individuation in depth psychology. It explores the pain of birth, of growing up, of leaving the family, of facing one's fear and finding empowerment in one's place in the world. And so facing fears is what we call shadow work in both Jungian and Campbellian theory, meaning that the monsters the hero comes to terms with are actually parts of the self that are abhorrent, unconscious, and suppressed. In some cases, the hero's journey also explores apotheosis, where the hero experiences spiritual transcendence, transformation from whom they were before, into a more transpersonal being. So all of that sounds great. However, there are some negatives to the hero's journey. It claims to universalize a hyper-masculine Western story of independence and achievement through violence. It has these externalized others rather than doing that internal shadow work. It often features characters who are already marginalized in Western society, such as women, people of color, queer people, foreigners, and other quote unquote monsters. It also replicates what we call the drama triangle, emphasizing one masculinized person as the rescuer and the rest of the world as either persecutors that must be conquered or as victims that must be saved. And this is a fundamentally dysfunctional and disempowering structure that has been embedded into much of our stories and our media. Also, the monomyth implies that no other stories exist. It erases other culturally significant story structures. It especially erases non-Western and or indigenous storytelling. So what is a role-playing game then? Role-playing games are co-creative experiences where participants immerse into fictional characters and realities for a bounded period of time through emergent playfulness. There are three main types of role-playing games: the virtual or digital, tabletop, or live-action role-playing. We're going to be talking about tabletop and LARP today. And there's three main functions of role-playing games. There's community creation, skill training, and identity exploration, and that will be the main focus. So imagination, role-playing games, and identity. So identity is really important, and so is exploring imagination in modernity, trying to figure out who we are through the use of our imagination. So Carl Jung talked about active imagination, which is immersing into the inner images that are produced by the unconscious, bringing those images to consciousness through expression and enactment. And this is particularly interesting in RPGs, as they are usually a group process rather than an individual process. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. There's also this ironic imagination when participants engage in subcultural activities around texts that they know are fictional, but they pretend to be real as a means to re-enchant the world. And then there's the mythic imagination, which uses myth and story, including LARP, as a means to make meaning and create a personal mythology in an increasingly secularized world. And this mythic imagination is very much based on Campbell's work. So following that, Craig Page has talked about myth making in RPGs. And he talks about three layers of myth. There's the world myth, which is the setting, and it often uses archetypal or mythical material. There's the heroic myth, in which every character is a hero in their own story, even if their deeds are not particularly heroic. Unlike in traditional myth, role-playing games are open-ended, and the characters cannot be so clearly defined as good or evil. Sometimes they embark on a quest of some sort during this level of myth, and that could be an external adventure, or it could be an internal journey of self-discovery, or both. And then he talks about the player myth. And these are the myths that are told by the players after a game about themselves and about their characters with relation to the story. Also, enactment of archetypes is really important in all of this. They have several archetypal identities to draw upon when playing role-playing games. So regardless of whether we consider archetypes universal or socially constructed, they are easy to recognize and therefore easy to embody and emulate. And so some typical archetypes in RPGs, of course, the hero, but also the mother, the sage, the trickster, the witch, the villain. So even within the relatively open affordances of role-playing games, heroes are often valued in the game, whereas other archetypes are seen as untrustworthy, such as the trickster. Within this, there's the personal psychology of role-playing characters. Unlike in myths or media with simplified character structures, role-playing characters are very nuanced and complex because they evolve over time. They emerge organically from character interaction and from within the self, and they resonate with individual players more deeply because they come from their individual psychology. And thus individualization, as we talked about before, and transformation are possible when the personal psychology of the player meets the personal psychology of the character, as well as the archetypes, and all of those things intermingle. Integration of these experiences, however, is very necessary, including processing, distilling takeaways, taking insights into daily life, etc. So processing is necessary, and this includes shadow work, even when playing a quote-unquote hero character. Through symbolic enactment, players can use game narratives as roadmaps for their lives, whether as cautionary tales, aspirational narratives, or other meaningful forms of ritual. Players can also weave stories from RPGs into their narrative identity, creating a more empowering structure of belief about themselves. But this all takes work. Then there's the social psychology of role-playing. So as in daily life, role-playing game characters are often described by and inextricably linked to their social role or function that they embody. So this could be the healer, the fighter, the prisoner, the leader, the child, etc. So while role-playing games can provide a space for experimentation and transgression, there may be in-game or off-game consequences for acting out of role. So it is important for them to maintain that social identity, even within play. Additionally, role-playing games are fundamentally relational, meaning that they emphasize social dynamics, whether in terms of conflict, cooperation, and/or intimacy. Therefore, lone wolves, like the hero in the hero's journey, are at a fundamental disadvantage in role-playing games. Instead, they incentivize sociality, both in the game and off-game, to co-create the story together. Also, people can enact alternative mythic structures, focusing on the importance of the protagonist in an interconnected web of togetherness. And this is similar to Valerie Frankel's Heroine's journey, where she talks about the heroine trying to reclaim the family and bring it back together. And so role-playing game design can be shaped to focus on social interconnection as well, as we will see. So I'm going to go over 4 examples very quickly. There's Dungeons and Dragons, which is a traditional role-playing game that emerges out of the wargaming subculture. So as you can see, it's very appealing for the hero's journey. It has the typical journey of trajectory of defeating monsters, looting for special items, and leveling up in experience as a result. And it's this Western colonial fantasy where a character's ethics are given a label called an alignment. And this can be an alibi for actually unethical behavior. However, Dungeons and Dragons may look like the hero's journey on the outside, but it's almost always social, and characters must depend upon one another for survival. So this can be a space for players to experience personal empowerment and also to practice social skills. But then, the question comes up, what's the difference between this personal empowerment versus a power fantasy? So what's the difference between, for example, the empowerment triangle versus the drama triangle, which is that dysfunctional relationship cycle? Then there's Vampire the Masquerade, which is another traditional role-playing game that emerged out of the goth subculture. And it's called a game of personal horror, meaning that you're playing out different dimensions of villainy, or anti-heroes, if you will. It's designed around Jungian shadow work, and players come to terms with the monstrous in our contemporary world and within each of us. Characters must wrestle with losing their humanity to the inner beast. However, many players actually focus more on a hero's journey trajectory. They avoid focusing on this They instead emphasize power attainment, political maneuvering, adventuring, and leveling. And even though characters have built-in flaws, they are not always played upon, leading some people to call it superheroes with fangs. And when people are playing in this way, they miss an opportunity for deep identity development work. Alternatively, there's Bluebeards Bride, and this has also been designed around Jungian archetypes. As one of the authors, Whitney Strix-Beltran, studied depth psychology. It's a horror story game that's based on a fairy tale about a young bride exploring her new abusive husband's house. It focuses on a lack of control rather than control, from a feminine perspective rather than a masculine, in the face of masculine oppression, and that is embodied in the animus character. Players enact quote-unquote sisters within the bride's consciousness that represent feminine archetypes. So there's the fatale for the femme fatale, there's the mother, the virgin, and the witch. And it explicitly counters the hero's journey. However, many players find empowerment when enacting these archetypes, which is very interesting. It can be viewed through the lens of Maureen Murdock's heroine's journey, which emphasizes the search for wholeness within a patriarchal world. And then finally, there's Dream Askew, which is a post-apocalyptic story game about building a queer enclave for marginalized characters who are rejected from the intact society. These characters embody a neo-archetypal contemporary quote-unquote skin called, for example, the iris, the hawker, the stitcher, the tiger, the torch, and the arrival. And these do actually map to older archetypes as well, if you look deeply enough. They focus on alternative stories through the lens of marginalized people trying to build a community. So this is not so much about a hero's journey, but rather about community building. While characters can engage in quote unquote strong moves like violence or social maneuvering, it costs the player tokens. Now, if they make weak moves, quote unquote, such as sharing vulnerably and creating intimacy, that is rewarded by granting tokens. So in this way, the game incentivizes play around community building, working through personal and relational challenges, and survival. The game design itself is also interrelational. There is no game master that controls the story, like in traditional role-playing games, but rather there's shared narrative responsibility for creating interesting experiences for one another. So this also incentivizes collaboration off-game for the players. So some takeaways. Role-playing games can be a space to enact the hero's journey as well as subvert it, to enact traditional story structures while also deviating from them, embodying alternative myths, to create personal mythos emerging from the player's consciousness and filtered through the game design. And it can be a space to explore personal and social identity through archetypal enactments of all sorts. Here are some of my references. And as I said before, my name is Lynne Bowman from Uppsala University's Department of Game Design, the Transformative Play Initiative. Thank you very much for your attention.